Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. My name is Steve and I'm your host. If you ever want to get in contact with me, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always just send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And we're also on various social media platforms at either the History of the Papacy or A2Z History. Now, I want to mention the great way to support the show, and that way is Patreon. Patreon is a great way to financially support the show. The most important thing about joining on Patreon is for you'll be entered into the history of the papacy diptychs. Now, in traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops who are commemorated during specific points in the liturgy or mass. In the history of the papacy diptychs, you will be memorialized during the beginning of episodes as well as in the history of the papacy in 10 minutes YouTube special, which is only at this point is only available on YouTube. There's also many other great benefits to joining on Patreon, and you can learn more by going into the show notes or going to patreon.com/history of the papacy. I have really been remiss in commemorating three important supporters of the show, Dapo, Roberto, and Peter the Great, who you may remember from the previous iteration of Patreon. These guys really stuck with me even after I left Patreon the last time. They are great supporters of the show and must be commemorated, and so they shall be. And let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, and Jeffrey at the Alexandria level, and Dapo and Paul the Magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching the ultimate power and prestige, we have of the See of Rome, Peter the Great. So this is a really fun episode for me today. It started off with an email from a listener who corrected me on a point I made about the history of the Christian liturgy in a couple of episodes ago. It turns out the listener is a university academic who has written papers on the history of the Christian liturgy. After that email, I just had to have on this person, and this person is Professor Andrew Messmer. New information's always coming out from the academy. It's especially exciting when it reassesses or looks at older theories in a new lens. And so that's what we're going to look at today, is reassessing the history of the Christian liturgy from this new lens and this new paradigm that's come out in maybe the last 2 decades or so, but we won't get into that too much right now. I really hope to have Dr. Messmer on in future episodes to discuss some great new ideas that are coming out in the field, and I'm hoping to get other scholars on as well to discuss these things. If there's any aspects of ancient Christianity or Christianity in any time period, really, that you would like to learn more about, definitely email me and I can try to put these things together on future episodes. Now, one last thing is please check out the History of the Papacy YouTube channel. I post new episodes of the History of the Papacy podcast in 10 minutes there every other Friday. So these are really just short episodes of a little snippet of church history, but they also have video and graphics that accompany them. And I think they're really fun. And if you have ideas you'd like for me to explore in 10 minutes or less, definitely send me an email and I'll look into doing that. Now, I also publish full episodes of the History of the Papacy, and Past episodes don't have video in them, but newer episodes will have video of me alone or me with the guest. So if you've ever wanted to see Gary Stevens and I on video, then this is your chance. If you don't want to see us, then you can still subscribe to the channel. But it's definitely an interesting thing to see us two together. I don't know. Maybe I've turned some people off to YouTube. I don't know. But you should definitely check it out. And if you're up for that visual, definitely click like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you get more videos just like this video and more. So now, with another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church, I'm joined with Professor Andrew Messmer. I'd like to introduce our special guest today, Professor Andy Messmer, who will guide us through a really interesting discussion of the very earliest developments of the Christian liturgy. I'm really excited for this topic today. Now, I first met Dr. Messmer when he very politely pointed out I was completely wrong in an episode. And now Dr. Messmer is a professor of New Testament, and he studied the development of liturgy. And when he pointed that out and he shared an article with me, it really opened my mind to a lot of new ideas that I felt like I had to have him on to discuss this issue today. So I roped him in, and I'm so happy that Dr. Messmer could join us today. And do you prefer to be called Andy, Dr. Messmer?
You can call me whatever you like.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're an associate professor at the Facultad Internacional de Teología, IBSTE, in Spain. Can you just tell us a little bit about your program and your academic interests and maybe how you got interested in early Christian liturgy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you can tell by my accent, I'm actually from America, born and raised in Indiana, but I've been here in Spain since 2012. And I am an associate professor at there in IBSTE, where I teach. I teach a few different classes, but I normally I go through the Book of Romans. And I'm an affiliated researcher at my alma mater, where I did my PhD up in Belgium at the Evangelical Theological Faculty. And here I'm actually calling you from Seville, which is where I live. I'm just on the outskirts of Seville, where I'm the academic dean of the master's program. So my technical training, I guess, is in biblical studies, but here I teach a lot of history and a lot of courses on worldview and missions, things of that nature. So, but yeah, so I guess as far as my academic training is concerned, and I'm more of a generalist. I like big ideas. I like taking something from one area and mashing it with something from another area and try to see if anything comes of it. So I perpetually feel like an idiot because I'm always talking to scholars and writing them emails, and they say, you're so out of it, you don't know what's going on. But they get me up to speed, and then I can usually bring out something nice and something new, which is what I like doing.
I think that's a thing that a lot of times in the academia today, that it's missing is the generalist who can see a lot of different areas and pluck out and pull in a lot of really interesting ideas that maybe the specialist is too focused in on that one narrow area.
Yeah, that's what I like. I'm from America, and we have a liberal education there. When I did my PhD in Belgium, everyone was specialists. So I was in the New Testament department, and they were just New Testament guys, but they didn't know anything about the Old Testament or anything about church history. And so it was always kind of I felt smarter than them in some areas, and I felt way behind them in other areas. So,
well, let's dig in here, and we'll start off with the kind of the big picture of the liturgy, and it's difficult to start, but maybe you could give us a technical definition of what is liturgy in a Christian context.
Sure. liturgy, that's actually a Greek word. It's what we call a transliteration. So it's just the Greek word behind our English word liturgy is liturgieo, which just is liturgy. What it means in Greek is service, or to render service to someone, especially in a public context. Like this word is found in Acts 13:2, where it talks about they were serving the Lord there in I forget, it's got to be Antioch if it's in Acts 13. So a lot of people, when they hear the word liturgy, they think of kind of the smells and bells of higher liturgy, what we call high liturgy, of Roman Catholic Mass, Anglican service, Lutheran service, Greek Orthodox. That's what they normally associate with liturgy. But liturgy is just what the church does when it comes together to worship God. And so every church has a liturgy. So I grew up a Baptist, and even though I always heard growing up, we don't have liturgy. Everyone has a liturgy. Just what do you do and why do you do it? What order do you do it? And I think, far from being a really kind of theoretical topic, I think liturgy is probably one of the most practical things that a church can wrestle through, because and I guess I should say liturgy is an extremely theological statement, because our theology actually manifests itself in the liturgy. And so if you want to get an understanding of what a church believes, you can actually just attend one of its services and you can pretty much figure out what it believes.
What are some of the earliest records and sources for our understanding today of the Christian liturgy and its very basic foundations?
Well, that's really frustrating because we have so few, which actually kind of makes it exciting too, because you really have to be a good investigator and to stay focused on it. But if anyone wants to know what a church service was like in the earliest century, or the earliest decades of the Christian movement, I would say 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 14, where Paul just kind of talks about what's going on at the church there. And then actually, strangely enough, this little passage from Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12, that's another place where we get kind of a glimpse into what were these people doing in the very first decades. And when I say the first decades, I mean, according to traditional chronology, Jesus' death and resurrection was around the year 30 or 33. And we're talking about the years, 50, the 50s, the 60s, right in there. And then outside of the New Testament, the best source that we have is a document I'm sure you've talked about on your show called the Didache, and that's been variously dated to the year 50 or 150. And so a lot of us, we just say about the year 100 is when it was written. And then we have a few other sources like Pliny the Younger. He makes this little allusion to what Christians were doing up there in Bithynia. Ignatius, he makes some references to what he's used to in Antioch and what the churches are doing there in Asia Minor. And then really we get the first good evidence of what church liturgy was like in Justin Martyr, and that's in mid-2nd century in Rome.
You had forwarded me a really interesting article you wrote that said, called Early Christian Liturgy, a Reconstruction of All Known Liturgical Components and the Respective Order. And in the article, you said that there was a paradigm shift in the field in the last 20 or so years. What was maybe the traditional view of the early development of liturgy? And then we can start to talk about this, how the paradigm and how the idea shifted.
Well, you really shouldn't feel bad about being wrong on your last episode on liturgy. Everyone thinks this. Everyone thinks that liturgy, the background for Christian liturgy, is the Jewish synagogue, and it makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at 3rd and 4th century liturgy. I mean, reading from the Bible, and certain people reading and certain people reading, and it's Jewish liturgy does look like Christian liturgy, but I think it was the mid-90s is when the first major monograph was written on the topic, saying we got to stop trying to make this. How's the expression go? Is it a square peg in a round hole, or a round peg in a square hole? I forget.
Yeah. I use those interchangeably.
Okay. Yeah, they just got tired of it, and they're like, look, this just doesn't make sense. Where are people eating meals together? Where are people talking together? What did Jesus do with his disciples? And so they started saying, we got to look someone else. And that's when they really took it, really took what's called the Greco-Roman banquet more and more seriously.
Maybe tell us just a little bit about, I think probably a lot of people are familiar with some of the elements of the banquet, but I didn't realize that the banquet was a more of a formalized institution than just people eating and then maybe drinking and then talking, that there really was a flow of events in a proper Greco-Roman banquet.
Yeah. It was, I guess you could think of it as somewhere between structured and informal. There were always two basic components to it. When you came together, you would start eating food, and there would be probably a servant there that would bring you food. There may be some games that were played. There's really interesting drawings from the time period. It looks like they're playing games with trying to throw wine at something in the middle of the room, or trying to throw grapes or something like that. They may have done something like that. And then afterwards, they would take away the tables. I guess I should explain that, how you would come over to someone's house, and it's pretty much like a dining room, only instead of having a table with chairs, actually you would be reclining on these really little couches. I shouldn't say little, but they're not very tall. You can lie down on them, but they're not very tall. And then you'd have these small tables in front of you, and that's where they would put all the food. And after that, they would take away the tables, and then they would start more of the, I guess, entertainment or social hour, where there could be anything. There could be someone playing music. There could be something I like to think about is all of the neat readings they would have done. You would work your way through, Homer or Plato or something like that. So where, a small audience could take it in, or someone who's an author, they may share like a rough draft of one of their works. I would like to have been in one of those sessions. But lots of things that could have happened during that time. And it would last all night long.
I posed this topic in the Facebook group because liturgy seems to be always comes up as a really interesting topic, and it garners a lot of interest. And a listener from Facebook, Susan, she had a very similar question to mine, in that, was there any connection with either synagogue-based worship? Now, I know synagogue-based worship was still kind of in its early evolution, even at this point, but even to Second Temple and actual temple worship?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer, because the way that I think of it is like this. What was frustrating scholars was they knew what a Jewish synagogue service looked like, and they knew what a Jewish temple service looked like. They knew what a Greco-Roman mystery initiation religion looked like. And the Christian service just didn't look like that. And so what was really puzzling scholars was the basic form of what was what was on the agenda. But when you talk about the content of the different components in that agenda, that's where I think is the most likely influence of Jewish liturgy, theology, and not just from the synagogue. We have to remember that there were all sorts of different Jews doing all sorts of different things, especially in the first century. You have Jews doing things in the temple, and we know that Christians continued to attend the temple for at least a while, which is very interesting to think about. They were doing things in the synagogues, and they were also doing other things in other contexts. I mean, just think of the Essenes, or what Philo of Alexandria calls the Therapeutae. There were Jews doing all sorts of different things during the time. And so all of this, I think, probably influences one way or another Christian liturgy, not the form so much, but how that form was filled in with theological content.
So at this point, would you say that the theory or the idea that the earliest Christian worship was based on the Greco-Roman banquet, is that pretty much the consensus now, or is it still kind of transitioning? Where would you say like that idea is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too, because I would say that amongst they're called liturgiologists, amongst people who study liturgy, I think it's pretty well established. I haven't read anything lately that continues to say, no, we got to go back to the Jewish synagogues. I think everyone says it's the Greco-Roman banquet, just because everything clicked. And this would actually maybe be interesting. This is a little bit off topic too, but there's two different ways that a paradigm shift can happen. One can be with a discovery of new documents, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We think Judaism looks like this, and then we discover all these documents and we realize it actually looked like that. And that's, a new discovery. But that's not what happened here with liturgy. We didn't discover anything new in the 90s. There was no major find. The other way that a paradigm shift comes around is people getting tired of, whatever that expression is, shoving the square or round thing into the square or round thing. They just get tired of it and they say, let's look somewhere else. And that's kind of what happened here. So I will say this: if you do read other people who aren't liturgiologists, like maybe a New Testament scholar, Old Testament scholar, church historian, they're not up to speed, they may continue to say these things. In fact, I was just speaking with a friend out here. He's actually a really good historian. And he keeps saying that. And I said, well, you have to look at the Greco-Roman banquet too. And he said, oh yeah, sure. Yeah. You got to look at that. I don't think he realized how significant it is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it is so relatively new, 25 years, that it takes time for it to spread out throughout all the literature. And
yeah. And that's one of the things I like about, for example, your show is, this gets direct access from what's happening in the scholarly academia right to people. So, it'll take another, I don't know how many years for it to kind of trickle its way all the way down to where it's kind of the established norm for everyone. But that's why I like shows like this, where you go right from academia to everyone. So I like
I really do try to tap into like what's going on like in the latest research. A lot of times it's hard to get to the most cutting edge things, but it seems, at least with biblical studies, New Testament, early church, that it does evolve rather slowly. So, you can kind of see what's going on, and not being a trained academic in church history, I'm kind of relying too on the secondary sources as well. You had mentioned in the article about early Christian meeting houses. How would they have, so like the Dura Europos house church, that's one of the very first church, actual church buildings that they found, but there is evidence from the Paul's letters of praying in houses. There must have been an evolution, obviously, in like 200, 150, 200 years, that there was a big evolution in how people prayed. So in the earliest times, it would have been in a proper person's house where they would have had the triclinium with 3 or 9 chairs arrayed around the table, but that would have been a pretty small event. Do you think that they would have been maybe 9-10 people, or was there an option to bring in more people into that, that whole banquet idea?
You just asked one of the fascinating questions that I have, because we just don't know. But that is a very fascinating question. Let me just back up and talk about Dura Europos just a little bit. That's actually a very good illustration of around the second the 200s, second, early 3rd century, whatever you want to say, of actually a house church. We know it was a house, but they actually busted out a wall to make more room for more people, and they've also done some other renovations. But that's a very interesting transition between meeting in a house and meeting in what later would be the basilicas. They actually would expand houses to make more room, which itself is not insignificant. But so then going back to kind of the what a church service would have looked like.
They have when Paul in his writings, would they have been a really small event of maybe 9-ish people, or did that whole Greco-Roman idea, the banquet, have an option for expanding out of just the 12 people or 9 people who could fit in the table?
It looks like they were small meetings. And we get that, for example, from Acts chapter 20, that little portion that I mentioned. It looks like there was an option, at least amongst some at some banquets of not only removing the tables, but then actually removing the small couches. And once you do that, instead of, everyone lying flat, when they all sit up, which like James 2, it talks about having people sitting at your feet. It seems like that was at least one option of people in there, of getting people into the room. Once you do that, you can expand as many as, if you cram them in, maybe 20 people. Now, something that's never been talked about is you got to think about meeting. If you basically just think of a modern apartment, that's pretty much what we're talking about is a modern apartment with similar size and a similar layout. Maybe having people in the kitchen or maybe having people in an adjacent room, that would also allow for more people. But and then if you go out into the country, just like modern today, you go to a country house and it's a much bigger house. That was the same back in the first century, where you could fit as many as 50 people in some of these rooms. So, but see, that would have been what we would call today a mega church. You couldn't have a meeting of bigger than 50 people, which really affects the dynamic. I'm in America, I was used to thinking of a church of 50 people as a very small church. And usually it was on its way kind of to closing its doors, but that would have been quite a large church in the first century. And that really affects, I think the main thing that it affects is you have a really strong intimacy and really strong self-identity and what's the word I'm looking for? It's, I guess maybe accountability, where if you go to church or if you don't go to church, everyone notices. A lot of these mega churches today where there's 15,000 people, no one knows if you're at church. You don't know anyone's name. If you go to a church where there's only 10 to 20 people there, they know you very well. They know your life and they know, it's very, we would say intrusive into your personal life, but that's how they did it.
What in the Greco-Roman banquet, was there a place for women in that generally, or did that really go from place to place? And then maybe speaking to how that transferred to the Christians adopting the banquet, did they include women in that?
Yeah. Okay. What you just said reminded me of something else I want to say about the previous point. We do have this really interesting comment. I can't remember if it's 1 Corinthians 11 or 1 Corinthians 14. I'm not sure which of those two chapters. It does talk about when you all come together. Now, what's interesting about that one phrase, and it only occurs at one time, is that there may exist the possibility of both like we would call them house churches meeting, and then actually all the house churches coming together for meetings. And if that did happen, we don't know where they would have met, but it would have had to have been somewhere other than a house that could have had more than a house. So that's interesting. As far as women are concerned, the passage I just cited, 1 Corinthians 11, just one example, talking about women prophesying. Now, there's a big debate over whether that was a good thing or whether it was a bad thing. I think it was a fine thing. I think that the text itself says that women prophesying, this is a good thing as long as it's did it the right way. I think that's a fine thing. And then aside from that, yes, women were actually, some of the women would host the meeting. That doesn't mean that they were the pastor or the preacher, but they were certainly the host. And another major ministry that they had was actually the role of a deaconess. And so they would assist in baptism, caring for the sick and the poor, and also probably helping out with the other widows. So that would be some of their responsibilities, or some of their involvement.
Let's start to look at the banquet structure and how that compared to early liturgy. Now, the banquet, in really broad strokes, was, like we said earlier, it was a shared meal, and then the symposium, which would be, like you had said, drinking, chatting, maybe a book reading. In the church context, I had read about something called the agape. And I had read that was usually at the end. Maybe tell us a little bit about what the agape was and if this fits into the structure and if that's maybe something was anachronistic to this time period or not.
Well, this is also debated, but I think it's pretty fair to say that the agape was the food. The agape was the banquet. It was the same thing. Now, the big question is when was it? Was it before or was it at the end? And we don't know exactly when or where the shift happened, but this is another just fascinating thing, is we know in the first century, the order was always, or at least from all the evidence that we have, it was you would have a meal and then you would have, like a reading from the Bible and preaching. And then actually you'd have a lot of dialogue. You'd have people singing, you'd have people praying, you would have people maybe healings or speaking in tongues. It was the communication part of the banquet. When you read the Didache, which is around the year 100, it preserves that same order. But the time you get to Justin Martyr, which is mid-2nd century, it's been flip-flopped. And that's what causes so much confusion about what is the agape and when you do it, because now all of that stuff, preaching, Bible reading, and all that comes at the beginning, and then you get a meal at the end. And soon that meal will be reduced down to just a token sip of wine and a token crumb of bread. And we don't know when that happened. But I think that's where the confusion comes from, is that switch. And I will say, since that switch has happened, it's never gone back. I don't know of any major tradition or denomination that celebrates the Lord's Supper first and then has the preaching and all the rest at the end. It's one of those very interesting developments that I don't know if there is an explanation to it.
So this would have been like a full-blown meal of, a full whatever Roman meal, but it would have had a Eucharist celebration or a ceremony, if you will, folded into that proper meal of sides and duck or whatever they ate back then.
Well, that's actually another interesting question. What they would have eaten. Most of the people from the movement were quite poor. And your average poor man's dinner was bread. And the bread back then wasn't, like the sliced bread that we eat today. It was very, very hearty and very, very dense. But that would have been a dinner. There may have been some olives there, some garnishes. And then if you are getting to the richer categories, you could get quite extravagant. Actually, they found, imported fish from, hundreds of miles away, found in Corinth and all of that. But that would have been just a very common meal. So it would have been a full-blown meal, and the staples of the time were bread and wine.
There's another interesting point that got brought up in your article and that I've read in other sources, is the actual timing of the event. Traditionally, in most Christian contexts, pretty early, all the way to today, it's Sunday morning, but that wasn't necessarily the case then.
No, it's called the Lord's Supper for a reason. I mean, at least in my tradition, that's what we call it, the Lord's Supper, which to me, I can't even say it without kind of smirking a little bit when we think about what we're actually doing, because in the first century, you would actually go to someone's house. You would meet in the evening, and you would have a meal. And today we go to a building, we meet in the morning, and we have a little token sip of wine and a little crumb of bread. It just that happened somewhere in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, right in there. I mean, all these things are slowly, because just because something starts in Rome doesn't mean it happens in Egypt and vice versa and all that. But it happened somewhere along the lines that got switched from the evening to the morning. And again, just to think about these are just so interesting, just to think about what that does to a church dynamic when you meet Sunday morning and you think, okay, I have to get back to have lunch, for example, what that does to what the church really is, which is people loving one another, ministering to one another. But if you meet in the evening and you've already had your meal, that does give you a lot more time to have deeper relationships, more true relationships, invest more in people, and be the church.
Were there other components to the liturgy, such as singing, that we would know about? That there's singing today, and that so there's obviously a place in the banquet for readings and that sort of thing, but singing, prophecy, even liturgical dancing, and all of that.
Yes, absolutely on the singing, and that's another interesting issue. We have a lot of description of what the Jewish synagogue service looked like, but interestingly, not one reference. There's one possible exception, Philo. But from the New Testament, from the Mishnah, from Josephus, and from the other writings in Philo, none of them say that in the synagogue they sang, which is to me just very interesting to think about. But yes, the Christians did absolutely sing in the early church service. We don't know if they used music or not. That's one of those questions. We don't know if they use music. But the other things that you mentioned as far as prophecy, and there's a big debate of what prophecy means, but whatever it meant, they were doing that. As far as dancing is concerned, we do know that some of the Jews, they would dance, and their dance would be maybe a little more structured and choreographed and like a free, free dance that you would see at a club today. it would be more like an embodiment of a certain truth. They would try to act that out somehow. We don't really know. I haven't seen any reference to dancing. But yeah, they would also have like commissioning services. We know that if someone was leaving, usually it would be, well, not usually, but like if someone was moving away, or later on it would be to commission deacons to go to another church for another reason for some point of service. They would have like a small commissioning service. So, I mean, it really was pretty familial, and which makes sense if you're always meeting in someone's house and always having meals together. You're meeting each other with a kiss, which was a normal, a proper greeting in those times. You're engaging in people's lives. You're eating together. You're growing together, listening to God's word, and then you are ministering to each other in all sorts of different ways. And then, you're saying goodbye to each other and all of that. And you're bumping into them throughout the week because you have to be able to walk. You can't grab a car or anything like that. You're walking to someone's house. So it's pretty intimate.
It's pretty interesting. Who would have been running the show, so to speak, or presiding over this? Would it have been the host of the house? Or did they have somebody who was a formalized leader like the bishop? They have brought the bishop in to that house?
That's a great question. I think it's probably mixed. Just to give you an example, in Acts, if the numbers are to be trusted, and they seem to, Luke seems to be wanting us to trust the numbers, there were about 5,000 Christians within the first few weeks or months of the Christian movement. And there were only 12 apostles. Well, you take 5,000, you divide that out by about, we'll be generous and say 20 people per house. I mean, you're still talking about hundreds of house churches. There's no way that the apostles could get to all the houses every Sunday even. I mean, even if they worked from sun up to sundown, it'd just be too much. So we do know that other people were hosts. Oh, I did want to back up and say 1 Timothy 3, when it talks about the qualifications of the bishop, one of the qualifications is he has to be hospitable, interestingly enough. And I don't know, but I just wonder if one of the reasons why a bishop had to be hospitable was precisely because he would be hosting one of the meetings. Just to take a one step back, though, don't forget that in the first century, there was no difference between a bishop and a presbyter. That doesn't come on until really the 3rd century, and then especially the 4th century, where there's one bishop over a bunch of presbyters. So that we do know, like, for example, the end of Colossians chapter 4, it does talk about there was a woman who was hosting a meeting in her home. And that's just one example of a woman hosting a meeting. But as far as who it was, I think it could probably be pastors, and it could also be what we would call laymen hosting them.
It's interesting to me, whenever I read Corinthians or I hear Corinthians, that there was a local church that had problems within like the first decade. How many people would have been in this? They talk about 2 separate camps and that there's all this conflict. Is this really conflict amongst maybe 2 dozen people?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I've never actually asked myself that question about how many people were in Corinth before, but I don't think I could give you a really good answer. It has to be at least sizable because Paul, at the beginning, he's talking about Chloe's household. So he doesn't just say, that one household that everyone knows of. He has to give the name of them. And then he actually talks about some other people who were sent at the end. And he's also talked about various speakers who have passed through there. So it had to have been at least sizable. But I couldn't even hazard a guess as far as how many were there. As far as breaking into different factions, that seems to be what would have happened, is that some houses would have, something would have started in one house, and then it would have attracted, whatever faction you're on, maybe you would start going to that house. That is the general thought that we get. I think it's one of the smaller epistles of, it's 1 John 2. Yeah, 1 John 2, it talks about they went out from us because they were not of us. That seems to be referring to a church split where we were meeting in one household, and then they actually went out and started meeting in another household, just down the block, same city and all that. But that seems to be to talk about church division.
Where would have the diversity been within the liturgies? Would it have really have been from house to house or town to town? Or did they all do, I guess within that framework of the banquet, there was a lot of room to improvise, but was there some sort of standardization within towns or houses, or was it pretty much free flow?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We just don't know about it. I will say this, he's arguably one of the most influential liturgiologists of the second half of the last century and then the first half of this century. His name's Paul Bradshaw. I sent my article to him actually before I was dialoguing with him a little bit through email, and he is this is to use his own language. And in one of his famous book, he says there's two different groups of people. There are lumpers and splitters. So people who kind of like to say, generally, this is how things were like, and we'll just kind of make this the form of the mold. And then there's people who say, no. They did it like this way here, and they did it like that way there, and they did it like that way there. And so he's a splitter. He calls himself a splitter. And so he says, he didn't say these words, but he said, I don't like your article. He would say that what my article does is it makes it too uniform. And he would say, we don't know how it was done from church to church to church. And so it's really according to everyone's kind of their own preferences of whether they like to see a basic unity, or whether they like to say, unless I see absolute hard evidence, I'm not going to hazard a guess and say that they did it like that. So I think that to get into your question as far as how I would answer, I think there was probably a basic unity of really the staple liturgy. I think it's almost certain that people would have met each other with some type of a kiss. There would have been some type of a discipline before the meal. Obviously, the meal would have been there every week, and sometimes at a daily occurrence. Reading the Bible, preaching or teaching, and singing at just all over the place. And then some type of where you're speaking in tongues or you're prophesying or something like that. I think kind of the staple part of it was probably pretty common.
A listener and a good friend of mine, Antonio, he had a question about when did Latin start to replace local dialects in the West? And that sounds like that's probably something beyond the scope, because at least in the West, most people were speaking some version of Latin pretty late on, and definitely past our time period. But what if people had tended towards a liturgical language? Because since all the source documents were written in Greek originally, would that have predominated?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's what we know, and it's not very much. It's, we're always frustrated with how little we know. Even if we find new stuff, we still complain we don't know enough. But from what we know, and you know this, the first Latin author that we have is Victor of Rome from the late 180s and 190s. And before that, we just don't have any. In the same town, someone who is writing for the edification of his church, he writes the Shepherd of Hermas in the mid-2nd century, and he doesn't write it in Latin. He writes it in Greek. And so Greek, and that we're talking about Rome, And so it seems like Greek was just a pretty liturgical language. In fact, when you go east to India, to China, even as late as I'm thinking right now, the 7th century, 8th century, you find Syriac out there. You don't find Chinese or Hindu, at least for liturgical purposes. And then a lot of the liturgical terms are just transliterations. It's a Syriac term that is just vocalized by Hindu people and then written down in their own language. But this question actually makes me think. Now I'm just hazarding a guess here, okay? But it makes me think when Paul talks about having an interpreter for speaking in tongues, like in 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1 Corinthians 14, I think. I wonder if, I should say it like this. It would be interesting to see if that would be a good fit to this whole issue of speaking in tongues and interpreting, if it has to do with this very question where the language just isn't understood by other people. That would be really interesting to study out, and I haven't done. Maybe someone's done it already, but that's interesting.
In their context, speaking with tongues wasn't just speaking gibberish. It was when somebody who, say, spoke Latin just started speaking in Syriac or Aramaic. Was that generally the...
That is a very strong opinion. I'm not a real scholar on what tongue speaking was like. I just know that there are two camps, and one camp says 1 Corinthians 13, speaking in tongues of angels, that has to refer to some non-human language, and then other people say no. You go to 1 Corinthians 14, and it's very clear that it is a human language. So I wouldn't really know what side to come down on that one. But what you just said is definitely a well-represented side.
So just maybe to wrap up, what we are looking at, and this is a good summary, is that the very earliest liturgy, it would have been based on the Greco-Roman banquet with eating first, then teaching. But sometime about 100-ish years later, there's reference and documentation that those two things were switched, which is pretty much how things carry through to this day.
That's exactly right.
And there's not a lot of evidence of that between those earliest documents and the hundreds of how that switch happened.
No.
I mean, that's got to be really frustrating for people in the field.
It is.
And there's not even like any wild speculation to how that happened?
No, I don't, but I haven't come across it. Well, actually, can I make a wild speculation?
Absolutely.
I'm just thinking off the cuff here, but I do know that from a very early time, there was and I don't know the exact date from this, but it has to be at least mid to late 2nd century, where we find the rise of catechism and kind of a real more of a sharp distinction between a believer and an unbeliever. We know, for example, that there were unbelievers in early Christian meals, because in 1 Corinthians 14 it talks about, if you speak in tongues, or I think it's if you prophesy and there's no interpreter, how will the unbeliever know, that God is in your midst, or something like that. So, I mean, we know that it wasn't a closed affair, which is actually extremely interesting in and of itself just to think of. But so when you do get the rise of catechism, and the reason of catechism is to say, okay, you want to be a Christian, but you're not a Christian. And we know from later sources that actually they were dismissed before the meal came along. And so maybe the rise was just a sense of like, if you're not a Christian, you really shouldn't participate in this meal. But if the meal comes first, it's kind of awkward to invite someone to your house and say, okay, we're going to have a meal. You stay over there. When we're done, then you can join for the second part. Maybe it's just easier for them to switch the two. That's just a wild speculation. And I hope no one of your listeners eats me up for this. It just came to my mind right now.
It's interesting. I'm glad it came out of your mouth, the trained academic, because that does seem like a logical kind of just an organizational thing, that once the meal became more sacramentalized, if that's actually a word, but more symbolic, that you don't want to boot people out. You want them to hear the teaching part and the readings and all that stuff. But then once it's really the time for the people who are truly initiated, and that there is that those two aspects, that there is those two portions of the event, and there's one you don't want people in.
Right.
It's easier to have them leave than it is to, wait here and now you can come in for the rest of it. That second part seemed like maybe it was, like you said, a little bit looser of a cocktail party sort of atmosphere. And then when that becomes more serious, and that it is a strict, it's teaching and it's prophesying and all of that stuff, that it's, once those things start locking in.
Yeah. The way that I think about early Christian liturgy is I don't know what tradition you or your listeners are from, but I come from a Baptist tradition where we have like in-home Bible studies. We get together Friday nights or Saturday nights or even during the week. And, we'll get together and there'll be pizza there. We'll all have pizza. And then after the pizza, we'll have like a Bible study or something like that. And then maybe pray together or something along those lines. But that experience right there is vastly more similar to a first century church service than anything I do on Sunday morning, as far as like the structure and just the experience itself. Now, if, just kind of playing with what you said and with what I said before that, if somehow pizza became really significant, I think most of us would probably say, okay, if we're going to have people who aren't Christians here, we're going to put that off at the end, let them come to the Bible study. Thanks for coming. Thank you. It's been great. Dismiss them and say, okay, now we can have pizza.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe to wrap up our conversation today, what are some things that you're working on right now that are fascinating that maybe you'd like to share a little taste of it?
Yeah, well, actually, right now I'm editing. I just did this calculated this the other day with a friend. 5 different books. I have a book coming out on the inerrancy of Scripture. Most of this is in Spanish. I don't know if I can't remember if I'm doing anything in English right now. One on the inerrancy of Scripture. I'm doing one on this year is the 500th anniversary of Spain's most famous Protestant. His name is I'll say it in English accent. His name is Cassiodoro de Reina. And he's the author of the Reina Valera Bible. And so editing a book on that, we just found a ton of new texts from him. So our knowledge of him has just exploded this year. Editing another book on textual criticism, which I'm looking forward to. I'd say about 90% of the Spanish-speaking world is Textus Receptus, which I find is very, very interesting. And so I'm not Textus Receptus. I'm more critical. I'm not critical about the Textus Receptus, but that's not what I am. So we're editing a book on that. Editing another book on justification, and working on another book on Reina's his declaration of faith and his the catechism that he wrote. Very, very interesting person. But actually, where I'm calling you from is I said I was on the outskirts of Seville. I'm actually in I don't know how you'd say it, Santi Ponce. I don't know how you'd say it in English, but Santi Ponce is what we'd say here. And Santi Ponce is this town is where the monastery where all of the Protestants were living before the Spanish Inquisition found out that they were here, and they all had to flee. So that's why we're here, is because of that connection. So fascinating history, that's why we're here.
Well, that's really awesome. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Would definitely love to have you back on whenever you want to discuss things. There's so many different topics to talk about.
Yeah, I've got to really hand it to you. I've really enjoyed your show, and it'd be a pleasure to be back here whenever I'm invited.
Well, thank you very much again, and we definitely hope to speak with you soon.